Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. There's a lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. And tonight we are talking about a very, very disturbing subject, which of course is human trafficking, which comes in a whole range of forms, which Tershia is going to be unpacking for us. But before we get into that, I just want to make a statement. Isn't it interesting how for years the fake mainstream media had an obsession with you doing the right thing to save Granny from getting COVID? Little, if anything, is ever said about human trafficking, which is, according to reports, an inhumane criminal business worth over $100 billion, that's with a B, dollars per annum, and involving millions of people, mainly children. Where are the authorities and the so-called philanthropists on this? The billion-dollar foundations, you know, the Bill Gates, the George Soroses, the Clintons, the Rockefellers, etc. When it comes to stamping out child trafficking, they could do it in a day with the money that they've got. The foundations that the fake mainstream praise as philanthropic organizations saving the world, they're nowhere to be seen. Their agenda is not philanthropy. It is to use their tax-free, note the word, tax-free foundations to push their personal money and power-driven agendas. But don't expect the fake mainstream media to question their motives. Of course not. That would never happen. Now, I just want to go to the screen here and pull something up for us. There we go. All right. Now, let me get back to my rant. Well, the fake mainstream media are complicit. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few short videos which will basically give you an idea of how horrific human trafficking is. And in particular, we're going to be looking at what goes on when it comes to children. And remember, human trafficking often happens in the home and involves mothers in particular. Let's have a look at this video. Here we go.
You know, there's another point here that I think your viewers need to understand. The UN indicates that somewhere between 50 and 60,000 Ukrainian children have gone missing. Now, we know what that means. We know the sick disease of pedophilia that is widespread in the West and the United States. We have open borders, and 2.5 million people have invaded this country. Some of them have come in with criminal intentions. We also know large numbers of women and children have disappeared in this process.
Chunga naanza kusema no tunataka kujenga tumo nasema huyu mama ima saki yote kunaona yuko hapa aisha kufungia watoto wake Mansaka asiende kabatupe Mungu kubadai tikana ngase modifu ya bongo filme ya bote ndio filme bote bote shamba Mansaka bote bana ya bongo bila ya bongo Mungu moya Mungu moya ya bongo ya bongo tofa na telefoni bafungule usifungule mula kwanza pole pole unafilma pole 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 kwanza filma pole pole mkabarujisi pole pole asanje mbeo kwanza batosha unafilma pole angalia hata kaibe Nasema mama leo sana. Acha. Bate moi. Kwanza kufilme. Una filme bia ba filme ke samu nani? Na filme. Wewe aibe nani? Ba 5000 francs huyu. Toka mbeba. Ekipimo yake hii.
And finally, this is a trailer for a video that's coming out next month, and it's all about how horrific and how widespread human trafficking is around the world. Let's have a look at that.
How'd that make you feel? Giving a child his freedom. Felt good. You have been at this for 12 years.
My country, 'tis of thee.
Why are you doing it?
Sweet land of liberty.
Because God's children are not for sale. It is the fastest growing international crime network that the world has ever seen.
For Homeland Security, you know we can't go off rescuing Honduran kids in Colombia.
This job tears you to pieces. And this is my one chance to put those pieces back together.
And yet somehow you have failed to bring me one real-world lead.
It's over, Tim. Close up and come back home.
So you quit your job and you go and rescue those kids.
South of that river is all rebel territory. No one goes in.
What if this was your daughter?
So, she's gone. Hear that? That's the sound of freedom.
Sound of Freedom is one of those films that can legitimately change this world. So we want to ignite a fire in audiences and open their eyes to the dark reality of millions of children that need our help. Let's make this film a historic event and the start, the end of child trafficking. Theaters across this country are already selling out. Pre-order your tickets today, and you can send the message that God's children are no longer for sale.
All right, so there you go. That just gives you an idea. You know, this is something that is never talked about in the fake mainstream media. Isn't it incredible? I mean, millions of kids being trafficked every year, and it doesn't rate a mention in the fake mainstream media. They're obsessed with COVID jabs. That's what they're obsessed with. Follow the money. Just follow the money. And that'll tell you why. I'm going to get my guest on now, Tershia de Klerk, and of course we're going to be talking about human trafficking in all its forms. Hi, Tershia.
Hello, Scott. Nice to speak to you again. Oh, thank you so much. Good, yes, I decided not to blur anything out in the back today. Yes. The Sound of Freedom, yes. Mm. I think the main message, Scott, is that human trafficking is alive and well. We are actually sitting with a crisis, actually for years now in South Africa, for instance, where we have authorities that are actually saying that, you know, human trafficking is a myth, and that it is, you know, people are blowing it completely out of proportion. You know, it's false claims, that there's very little evidence of TIP in South Africa, TIP being the terminology that we normally use within the human trafficking sphere, which stands for trafficking in persons. So when I say TIP, then that is what I'm talking about. So what they are saying is that, you know, in South Africa, we do not have a problem. And we are actually talking about quite prominent people within government even that is claiming this. But what makes it even more disgusting is they are saying particularly sex trafficking and child trafficking. They are saying that it stems from widely accepted myths and moral panic. So this is what so many leaders and authorities out there are saying. And just to put it bluntly, the reason why they're doing this is because they also have a finger in the pie, because this is an industry that is growing so rapidly. It is the fastest growing illegal industry in the world. And the second biggest industry, illegal industry in the world. So obviously, you know, drug trafficking is first on the list. So there's so much money within this organized crime that unfortunately we have leaders, we have prominent professionals, etc., that are also part of syndicates, or they have a finger in the pie. Because remember, when we talk about human trafficking, a person can be sold over and over again. Where there is a demand, there needs to be a supply, and unfortunately, our children and mostly our women are the supply. So the message that this movie needs to bring to the world is the fact that child trafficking is not a myth. There is extensive studies that have been done. We just recently received a tip report, our latest tip report, based on South Africa, which does not come from the South African government. It comes from professional individuals who are working in the front lines, helping to combat human trafficking and exploitation. It comes from NGOs who are working and sacrificing time, resources, funds, etc., to expose this evil. So, in other words, it's coming from reliable sources. And this tip report is bringing to the forefront the reality of human trafficking, including child trafficking in South Africa. And one of the NGOs that I'm referring to is, for instance, our National Human Trafficking Hotline. They are basically the front runners in South Africa that face cases that are phoned through to them on a daily basis. And they have given and provided all the data that they have of real life stories that they've been dealing with since their inception, which I think was in 2016, but I speak under correction. So we cannot, unfortunately, rely on the so-called stats and the authorities that be when it comes to these kind of claims. We have to rely on the people that are working in the front lines, that are actually fighting these evils, and they have actually nothing to gain from it. So yes, so that is the message that I'm hoping that this film will bring to the world, just to make them realize that this is something that is real and that we can all play a role in trying to make a difference.
Right.
Mm.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, sorry, I'm just checking. I've got my audio on here. Yeah, the point I was making was that in countries like Colombia, child trafficking is huge. Now, I also just want to make the point that this open border thing that Joe Biden has done, where people are pouring in through the southern border from Texas or into Texas, I have been doing a bit of research on child trafficking leading up to this particular live stream tonight, and one of the things I learned is that most of the children who come across that border, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, do not have parents. They come across by themselves. What they do have, and this is where it really becomes disturbing, what they do have is like a staple or some kind of a pin with a piece of paper attached to it with someone's name and a phone number. And what the guards do when they pick them up when they come into the US is they phone that phone number and they say, do you know about a, and then they give the name of the kid. And of course the person who is actually responding to that call is the sponsor. He's the guy who's actually bought that child. And what the guards in the US do who've picked up the kid is they send, at the cost of the US taxpayer, that child to the address that that person who they phoned gives. So you've now got a child that comes through the southern border that is child trafficked, that is delivered by the US government to the trafficker or to the pedophile in the US. That's happening right now, every day. I mean,
yes, exactly.
Isn't that extraordinary?
But it is mind-boggling, and we have this happening in South Africa as well. We have one another front-runner NGO in South Africa is Love Justice. And what they do is they work at airports mostly, and their job is to identify possible victims of exploitation. So there are very, very few. I actually only know of them, organizations in the world that are basically an intercepting NGO. In other words, they're not preventative and they're not rescue, but they're in the middle. So they have also sent so many statistics and reports through for our latest South African TIP report that actually indicates, so many numbers of children that have been intercepted by airports. And exactly as you say, I'm just actually looking at the report at the moment, and they're saying that, what happens there were, for instance, 14 minors at one point that were intercepted, and they found not to have the required birth certificates and affidavits from parents. 3 possessed fake passports. And according to the Africa Director of Investigations for Love Justice, child trafficking cases go unreported or wrongly categorized when a misunderstanding of the types of trafficking exists, when human trafficking is prevented, and in those cases, the exploitation has not yet occurred. So Love Justice I take my hat off to them, because to them it's even more difficult. In South Africa, if the exploitation has not yet occurred, it is so much more difficult with the authorities that be to convince them that this child is on his or her way to be exploited or to be sold into slavery. So yes, so these are the realities that we are facing across the globe.
Yeah. Now, you've got an organization called the Joseph Movement, which actually works in this area. Do you want to tell people a little bit about your work before we carry on about human trafficking?
Yes, thank you, Scott. So the Joseph Movement started because of just a desire to actually try and make a difference, specifically within South Africa. And so what we do is we focus on prevention. We focus on prevention, education, as well as victim identification, because what we have found from our reliable sources, such as the National Human Trafficking Hotline and the Global Slavery Index, the UN's stats and so forth, is that only up to 2% of trafficked victims ever get saved or manage to escape. So the key is prevention. So preventative education is what we focus on. We work not only with children within different cultures and different communities, but we also work with adults within different cultures and communities. At the moment, we only do our education programs in Afrikaans and English, and we are hoping to extend that. But at the moment, us being mainly within the Western Cape, English and Afrikaans works very well for us. So yes, so that is our main focus. Prevention is absolute key.
Right. Now, we've been talking about human trafficking of children, but it comes in various forms, doesn't it? Do you want to go through the different areas of child trafficking? Sorry, human trafficking, yes. Not child trafficking. Yeah, over to you.
Oh yes, of course, yes. So, look, there are different forms of child trafficking even. But it is actually such a vast list. So, but it's so important that we touch on it and that we keep on reminding ourselves of the different faces of human trafficking. So the most popular forms of human trafficking that we know of is sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Those are the forms of trafficking that are most prevalent across the globe. But then we also have the ones that are even more hidden. So we have also what is called domestic servitude, where a person comes across as a domestic worker. It can be in a private home, it can be in a hotel, in a B&B, in a restaurant, in a backpackers, for instance, where that person does domestic work but under very harsh circumstances, without the freedom of movement, with hardly any form of compensation. They live in fear, they're being abused, their lives are being threatened, or that of their families, for instance. And then there is forced marriage, which is also more better known in South Africa as ukutwala. Although ukutwala, where it originated from, it was a very beautiful practice, but throughout the years, it has unfortunately been distorted. And people have actually taken advantage of it. And now it's become a situation where young girls, some of them extremely young, are actually taken away from their families by force and handed over to older men for sexual pleasures. Then we've got baby harvesting, or what some people also call infant farms. Then we have organ harvesting, of course, baby harvesting, and then child soldiers. So child soldiers would also fall under child trafficking, where some of our children are taken across from South Africa, across borders into war-torn areas, and they're used as soldiers. And then another phase of human trafficking is forced begging, which is very prevalent specifically in South Africa. So that would also often fall under child trafficking. But then we also have adults, especially the more vulnerable women, that are also forced into begging by a trafficker, with, of course, very serious consequences should they not return with money or food or gifts. And then there's forced illegal activities. There are many children, for instance, who are forced into illegal activities that can be into, smuggling drugs, being a drug mule. It can be into theft or burglary, and even zamazamas, which we know in South Africa as the illegal miners. There are so many children that are being forced into illegal mining. Now, I know there are many, many people that have gotten extremely upset with me for mentioning zamazamas. But zamazamas, at the end of the day, are illegal miners. We do acknowledge that there are some of them that are doing it to at least have some form of living or make some form of living. However, we have children that are being forced into that arena of mining, and it is extremely dangerous, not just for them to get injured or lose their lives, but it's also extremely bad for their health. And then I'm almost done with the list. There's also snuff movies, which some of your listeners or viewers might know what that is. So people are trafficked for snuff movies, which are very disturbing movies that are placed onto the dark web. And then lastly, there's a phenomenon that's called bachabazi, which comes from the Middle East, but that basically means boy play. And that is also a form of child trafficking where children are being exploited by older men, specifically adolescent boys, where the boys are used for entertainment. They have to dance for the older men and obviously also give sexual favors to them. So that is quite a mouthful, but it is so important for us to understand and know that there are so many faces of human trafficking. And this is also why we say that human trafficking is a hidden crime, because it's often overshadowed and overlooked. You know, for instance, you will look at zamazamas and you would most people would immediately see, oh, illegal minors, you know, but they then overlook that there are victims of human trafficking that are being forced into that arena to be part of the illegal mining, and it includes children. Forced begging as well, for instance. It is something that we so take for granted. You know, we see it every single day in South Africa, but often we don't think that those children or that mom with a baby, yes, many of them are there because they have freely and willingly chosen to be there. But there are so many cases that we come across where they are actually forced and being threatened, and that is why they are standing there begging for money or for food or for gifts.
Yeah.
So these are just, I'm just always so grateful when people ask, you know, explain to us what is human trafficking exactly and how can we identify it. So it's always very important to remember that when it comes to human trafficking, don't only think about abduction or a child going missing or a container being shipped across the border or sexual exploitation. It is that as well, but it is so much wider, and we need to learn how to identify human trafficking correctly.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, one of the major areas is actually husbands trafficking their wives for sex. So it actually happens in the family home as well.
Yes, so there are most definitely those cases where, in many cases, it would be a case of grooming, where a man grooms his wife or a partner, and she obviously falls in love with him, and they start a life together, and they rent a flat together, and now you need to work for what I've given you.
Yeah.
And those kind of cases are just, there are so many of those cases where these women are forced into sex trafficking because they went into this relationship believing that this man will be taking care of her with so many promises, etc. And then they end up as sex slaves, or they end up in the prostitution system. And then we also have children that are being prostituted out of their own homes. And these are examples that I really feel very strongly in mentioning, because human trafficking does not require movement. In other words, movement is not a prerequisite for human trafficking to take place. And that is also something that is vital for us to understand. So movement is not required, which means that the exploitation can take place even within a home. So that's very important to always remember.
Yeah. Now, look, last night we had a interesting discussion, and one of the points raised by one of the guests was that the Sassa generation, as he called it, which is the people who get Sassa, has basically played a huge role in destroying the cultural aspect within many of the African tribes, like the Zulus and the Xhosa and people like that. So there's been a complete breakdown in their cultural way of living, like Lobola and things like that. It's it's now like when you think back 60 years with the white minority group in South Africa, you hardly ever heard of a divorce. And you look at South Africa today, I mean, divorce is almost like, it happens every day. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because what is happening is very disturbing, and we can actually see it happening on our watch, and that is the breakdown of the moral compass that society once had. And
yes, exactly.
This has been exacerbated by the introduction of comprehensive sex education into the schools at the age of 5, which is now even more putting children at risk. And in countries like Belgium and the United Kingdom, they're talking about removing the crime of pedophilia, because they're now suggesting that a child as young as 10 years old can fall in love with a man who's 50. And this is where the world is becoming a really sick place. And how is this going to impact human trafficking when you've got basically this being legitimized, the actual the child being sold off to someone older, and then it's not a criminal offense? I mean, that to me just sounds absolutely crazy.
Yes, look, I will be very surprised if that bill that you're talking about would actually be tabled and actually be approved. If that does happen, it would mean that civil society within those countries have not done their part to step up and to speak out, because there's so many scientific proof, there's so much research that has been done in so many other countries when it comes to sexual exploitation, when it comes to pornography, prostitution, human trafficking, etc., that you can't possibly deny the ripple effects of any of those practices. So it will, of course, increase human trafficking without a doubt. And the problem is, with human trafficking, with pedophilia, with prostitution, with pornography, it is the demand that is always the problem. The demand is the root of the problem. And that is what we as NGOs, specifically now here in South Africa, who are really fighting exploitation and human trafficking, we are saying that we have to get to the root of the problem. When it comes to the prostitution argument, for instance, it is the buyers that are the problem. Without the buyers, there would not be prostitution.
Yeah.
Without the pedophiles, there will not be children that are being abused and raped. So those people are the people that need to be targeted, and they need to be targeted hard. So, yeah, this is a very disturbing topic that you've brought up, but it is important. It is important for us to speak out, as we've now recently done in South Africa, for instance, Scott, with this whole prostitution debate. And we luckily are seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, because we had government that wanted to table the new prostitution bill, and they have just recently announced that they will not table it because it is unconstitutional. And it is because civil society raised their voices and, put their time aside to bring forth all the scientific evidence that we can possibly find, bring forth survivors. The survivor voices are vital. Now, of course, with children, it's a lot more complex. But with the adult survivors, their voices need to be heard.
Yeah.
And it's very important for governments to hear that there are people who were victims that are now not just survivors, but they are thrivers. And you need to listen to their voices. They are coming from that background, from that abuse, and they are telling you from first-hand experience that this is not a healthy route. And this is what it has done to my life and all the ripple effects it's had on my family, my community, and society. Yeah.
Wow. What I find extraordinary is that a child as young as 10, after going through this comprehensive sex education where they push the idea that you might be a female when you're a male, can start taking gender bender drugs and start having operations and stuff like that in the USA. There's some states which are banning it, but there are a lot of states like California which are actually promoting it. Now, at the age of 10, you can't drink alcohol, you can't smoke, you can't vote, you can't have a tattoo, but you can change start changing your sex. It's crazy. I'm actually talking to Dr. Peter McCulloch. Just so people don't know, I'm speaking to Peter McCulloch next week on Tuesday. That's Tuesday the 4th. We're going to be talking about this very issue, about this transgender situation and the damage that has been done to the children who get caught in this. It is a huge and growing issue, and it's all as a result of this comprehensive sex education that's been pushed in the schools and which has been marketed by the Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros, just for the record. That man is just sick. Now, just getting back to human trafficking, because human trafficking is so tied up with what's going on in the world today, we've got to kind of open Pandora's box a bit. Which nationalities have fallen victim to human trafficking in South Africa?
Yes, so in South Africa, because we are in South Africa, the stats that we are actually looking at, that's actually coming directly from this recent TIP report that was done by NGOs and civil society and professional individuals that are working on the ground. We see that the greatest percentage is South Africans within South Africa, and we're talking specifically adult victims. And then we have Zimbabweans, Malawians, and Nigerians. So those are very high up on the scale. And what I want to point out is that we need to understand, and many maybe already know this, I'm just speaking the obvious, that human trafficking is exploiting people's vulnerabilities. And we are seeing that so many people who are coming into our country, many of them legally and then many of them not legally. However, so many cases have gone through our South African system of people who are coming to our country who are trying to escape poverty or trying to escape, violence, or even trying to escape, things such as sexual violence and abuse within a culture or within a family in their country. They're coming to South Africa with a hope of a better life. Some of them are doing it the right way, some of them are not. And I'm not saying that those that are doing it the wrong way, that are like illegal immigrants, etc., are necessarily, I'm not condoning it. However, many of them are coming here for a better life. And then what's happening is they are being exploited. The traffickers are not working harder, they are working smarter. So we have an influx of people coming into our country. We have porous borders, unfortunately, as well. And they see these people that are so vulnerable coming into our country. It's an unknown country to them. There are cultural differences. There are linguistic differences, etc. And they are then taken advantage of. And we find that so many of them are being exploited. Many of them are being used for sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, or labor trafficking. We have, for instance, so many pop-up shops that one would see maybe in communities where there are, for instance, a Zimbabwean or a Nigerian running the shop, or managing the shop. There are Pakistanis. Pakistanis, I see, is a little bit lower on the scale when it comes to looking at the stats that we've recently received. But so many of them have been promised amazing jobs and amazing lives within South Africa. So once again, human trafficking has so many ripple effects. We have our South Africans that are struggling with jobs. I mean, we do have a problem with providing jobs. Now we have traffickers in our country that are luring foreigners into our country and promising them the world. And then when they come into our country, they are being exploited in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And so that is something that is very important for us to also just keep in mind. Not all of the foreigners in our country, we can't, as South Africans, necessarily get upset with them. So many of them are really coming here. They've either been tricked by a trafficker to come here with promises, etc., or they've just come here just for, with a hope of something better, with a hope of being able to provide for their families. And many of them end up as trafficked victims.
Well, most of the trafficked victims in Australia are exactly that. They're normally young Asian women who come into Australia with a promise of a job or something like that, and they're then brought under the control of one of these guys who just puts them out for prostitution, and that's what happens. It's just absolutely sick. Now, just talking about prostitution, we talked about the prostitution bill in South Africa very briefly. Do you want to tell us about how that bill came about and where you think this is going to go at the end of the day?
Well, I can say that this bill came out or peeked its little head out in December last year, very conveniently at a very strategic time where a lot of people were busy winding down for the year, businesses were closing, people were ready to go on holiday, etc. And many of us NGOs who combat sexual exploitation just had to take hands and start fighting against this bill. But luckily, what had happened earlier in this month is John Jeffries actually announced that the prostitution bill will not be tabled, and it is due to concerns around its constitutionality. So that was something that many of us were pushing, because the threat was that they wanted to table the bill and just push it through as quick as possible. And we were expecting that it was going to be imminent, either January, February. And we are just so grateful that that did not happen.
Yeah.
But that was because people were rallying together and making a noise, and also survivors, especially ladies who have come out of the system of prostitution, have also raised their voices against this bill. So basically what this bill suggested was to decriminalize sex work, as they call it. Although sex work is legally not a term, it's not an accepted legal term in South Africa, nor is it in any other country in the world that I'm aware of. But what they were actually saying, you see, this is how deceptive a government can be. It's not decriminalizing sex work. It was actually fully decriminalizing the system of prostitution. So what does that mean? That means, okay, we want to fully decriminalize not just those that are providing the service, in other words, the prostituted persons, but we want also pimps, brothels, and buyers to be decriminalized. Now, can you imagine, with everything that South Africa is already facing, what South Africa would look like if it was, or if it becomes, a free-for-all? Pimps are legal, brothels are legal, and buyers, you can purchase your heart out. So that is actually what it means. And so, so we took a very strong stand against that. And we will continue to advocate for the protection of prostituted persons, because we also know, because we are people who are working in the front lines, and we are very well connected with other NGOs that are directly working with prostituted persons, you know, that we have to take a stand to protect, as many call them, prostitutes. And funny enough, Scott, those that advocate for so-called sex work get offended when you call them a prostitute. But we don't call them prostitutes, because we know that there are so many of them that are victims of circumstance, or they are victims of trafficking. And it's just a known fact. There's absolutely no one who can come and argue and say that it is not true. It is a known fact, and there's the research that we can provide to prove it. And also, you know, the people that are in the prostituted system or the prostituted persons, we need to remember that they are daughters, they are sisters, they are mothers.
They're people.
Exactly. So that is why we specifically, we don't call them prostitutes, we don't call them sex workers. They are prostituted persons, they are people. And in some cases, they are also young boys, brothers and sons. So that's very important to just also remember. So many do not realize, many of them who are in the system of prostitution do not realize that they are being trafficked or even exploited. That is the extremity of the prostitution system. So many of them are in the system because of circumstance. They are a victim of either circumstance, they didn't see any other way out, they were blinded by whatever their circumstance might have been, or it is also within certain cultures. We have spoken to so many people who have said, you know, you would see a family of young ladies, of sisters, for instance. The mother is in the system. Now suddenly the older daughter goes into the system, and they all end up within that system.
Wow.
Because they have become so used to it, and they don't realize that they are being exploited and being trafficked, because prostitution is physical and psychological harm and abuse. And, you know, it also feeds on people's vulnerabilities, and that's very, very important for us to remember. So besides trafficking, I mean, prostitution fuels inequality, it fuels gender-based violence, male entitlement, lawlessness, and public decay. And then I was also mentioning the words sex work. We have survivors that are also standing with us, ladies who are just absolutely victorious, who have come out of that system, and they actually get offended by the words sex work.
Yeah.
Which is actually quite interesting.
I remember that. I remember that movie, Poseidon Adventure.
Yeah.
Did you ever see that film, Poseidon Adventure?
Oh no.
Poseidon Adventure. It's actually about a boat that sinks, and a few people survive at the end. But
Yes.
one of the women who's playing a role in the film used to be a prostitute, and she's talking to her now husband, who I think was an ex-cop or something like that, and she says, "Oh dear, I think I recognize that man." And this must be something that you know, kind of lives with you if you get into that sort of work. I just want to move on to something which I think anybody listening now who's got children or grandchildren should listen to very carefully, because you know a lot about this. What are the things that parents, grannies, anyone who's got young children under their control should do and shouldn't do to ensure that the children that they've got aren't kidnapped and trafficked? And I'm thinking, for example, of like Facebook, which I think is one of the most common ways that children are actually tracked down. So, yeah, over to you. What are some of the common ways in which traffickers find their victims?
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. I actually just realized that I get so excited that I didn't really properly answer your previous question. But I just want to say, just to complete that
Sure, go ahead.
answer
Yeah.
regarding the prostitution bill. So, so they will relook at that bill with our next election. So we're buying time. So within another year or two, that prostitution bill will come up again, and then of course our battle will start all over again. But I just wanted to mention that that's very important, and it's very important, that there's opportunities for the public to also raise their voices, and the more people who can raise their voices, the better, because this is vital, not only for our children, but for our communities and for society and for the future of our country. But okay, so back to the question that you now raised about, what can parents do? What are some of the most common ways that traffickers find their victims? So this is extremely important to just remember. So A21 is the absolute front runner when it comes to combating human trafficking. They are global, and they are very good friends with many of us smaller NGOs who also combat human trafficking. And so they started our national human trafficking hotline in South Africa. And what they have found is that the most known ways globally that traffickers find their victims is, number one, through false job advertisements. Now, with false job advertisements also comes fake modeling offers, as well as fake sports offers. So within certain cultures, soccer, for instance, is very popular in South Africa. So we find that a lot of boys get trapped by fake soccer offers. So fake job offers, fake modeling offers, as well as fake soccer offers, especially for the children, the younger ones, or the young adults, are the number one ways in which traffickers find their victims or manage to trap their victims. Then secondly,
just on that score, what young people should do if they get invited to a meeting, say to do with soccer or to do with a job or whatever, is they should go with other people. They shouldn't go alone, because that way, and maybe a parent or something like that, so that that the person who might be doing the trafficking backs off.
Oh, most definitely. That is very, very important. Is for them to, as a parent or adult, to teach them, that this is a possible exciting opportunity, but let's be wise about it and take someone with you. Take an adult, a trusted adult with you, most definitely. And then we also have the hotline, which does job vetting. So they actually also research any possible fake job offers or any other form of possible fake contractual offers. So it's very important. That's a tool that we can use here in South Africa. And I just want to encourage people to use the National Human Trafficking Hotline for those purposes. So if you're an adult or even a young adult, you can always contact them and you can give them all the information and they can investigate, and they normally would come back to you and say, there are too many red flags. We rather advise that you stay away. So just quickly, the hotline number is very easy to remember. It's 0800 222 777. 0800 222 777. So it's an easy number to remember. So number one is the false job advertisements. Number two is that people are sold by their own families. Number three is the lover boy method, and that's a form of grooming, and that can happen online, it can happen on the streets, it can happen at a school, at a college, where a young man makes or grooms a young girl, for instance, and she falls in love with him, and then he exploits her in various ways, or he hands her over to be exploited. Number four is being trafficked by a friend. So that would often fall under grooming. So when we talk about grooming, one tends to first think of, a man grooming a lady, but in South Africa, we've seen now with some of our stats that in most cases, ladies are being groomed by lady friends.
Wow.
Especially when it comes to, so they groom them in the sense of building a relationship, building trust, and then getting them possibly into a brothel, into prostitution, etc. So that's also something to look out for and to be aware of, that grooming does not only take place with a man to a woman, it can be a woman to a woman as well. And then the fifth one is abduction. So once again, remember, I always emphasize that movement is not a prerequisite for human trafficking to take place. So some of what I've just mentioned are examples. An abduction is only number 5 on the list. Although abduction is normally the cases that reach mainstream media and that we get bombarded with on social media, etc. But some of the most common cases are what I've just mentioned to you. And then, as mentioned earlier, Scott, traffickers are not stupid. They do not work harder, they work smarter, and we've got digital platforms, and the digital platforms are definitely one of the most popular platforms or tools that traffickers use to find their victims. And we have cybercrime professionals who have advised us that there are a few very popular tools, if I can put it that way, that traffickers use online to find their victims. And one of them is selfies. Okay, so selfies, why do we say selfies? Because when you use a smartphone, there's often geotagging. There's a lot of geotagging that happens on a smartphone. It also depends on where you logged into, etc. And when you post a selfie on social media, there's data connected to that photo. And with very simple hacking, traffickers can get into that data and it can give them some very vital information about, for instance, your common locations, etc. Another one is posts and tweets that are geotagged. So once again, going back to the geotagging. So remember, your geotagging, those are features on your phone and also on social media platforms that can be switched off. So that's very important to always remember that.
Right.
Running routes, or typically posted by smartwatches. I wear a smartwatch, and that was the very first thing that I made sure is switched off. So if you carry a smartwatch, it's very important. Make sure that your running routes and your location is switched off. And then also, these watches that became very popular years ago, Scott, that was like it's parental control GPS tracking watches. That was such a craze. It was an amazing tool that parents loved using, because now I'm going to know exactly where my child is, and my child will be safer. But remember, if you know where your child is, then a trafficker also does. So parental control GPS tracking applications or devices are one of the top ways in which traffickers track children.
Wow.
So those devices or applications are an absolute no-no, and they are no longer safe. They are actually extremely dangerous. And then I see this happening often on social media. We also need to teach our children and ourselves to not advertise our check-ins at locations. Many people do that. I see on Facebook, for instance. They would do their check-ins on locations on Facebook, and they will give away their location. And often it's a location that they visit on a regular basis. So those are just a few things that I really wanted to emphasize, because they are, at the moment, the most common ways in which human trafficking takes place, and also the most common ways in which traffickers manage to track their victims.
Right. Now look, two of the most important industries or areas of life where this should be actually addressed. One is by the government, who I think in South Africa are doing absolutely nothing about it. And the question on that score is the government helping you at all in what you're doing with your organization? And the second one, and you touched on this a moment ago, is the what I call the fake mainstream media, who basically, as you said, unless it's a really high-profile kidnapping or something like that, they don't talk about this issue, which is huge, and it's growing. What are your views about those two areas, government and media? What should they do to pull their socks up?
Yes, so when it comes to the net, when it comes to the internet, it is something that is extremely difficult to govern. But I do believe that apparently government is looking at ways in which they can be more strict, especially, I'm now talking about South Africa. But I don't think, Scott, that there is really any form of legislation or rules or bills or anything that would stop exploitation in the digital realm, because in real life, if I can call it that, it is already almost impossible. I mean, and I'm sorry, I keep going back to the prostitution bill, but that is just something that has shown us over and over again that it does not matter what legislation, what bills or regulations you have in place, the exploitation and the traffickers, they will always find new ways of operating. And unfortunately, when it comes to digital, it is a completely different world. It's a world on its own, and it is exceptionally difficult to not only track down perpetrators, but it is even more difficult to prosecute perpetrators generally. But when it comes to digital or the internet, it is even more difficult.
What about the media?
And I know that I know you know Laurie James.
Yes.
From Cyberetti.
Yeah.
So she would be, I'm sure she would give us an absolute brilliant answer to that.
Right.
I would love to know her take on that. And you were talking about the media, about social media, am I right?
No, mainstream media. Their lack of coverage, yeah.
Yes, mainstream media. With mainstream media, it is very difficult because it is normally the story that is the juiciest, the story that is the most exciting, the most dramatized. Those are the stories that will unfortunately reach mainstream media. And it is a very difficult fight, Scott, but us as NGOs and some of the other individual professionals that work within the tip arena, we do work very hard in educating mainstream media and trying to get them to also understand the technicalities around human trafficking and, around understanding legislation, the true meaning and description of specific wording, etc., so that when they speak to the public, that they would then bring the correct message across. Because, for instance, with the prostitution, once again, we recently had an incredible interview on that was done on SABC, and we were just blown away by that media coverage and the person facilitating the interview, because she was educated and she made a point of understanding how important it is to use the right terminology when you're talking about the prostitution system. And she emphasized, I am not going to talk about sex work because sex is not work and it's not a legal term, and no government has ever said or has ever approved that sex will be seen or be acknowledged as a form of work within that country. And she really understood it, and it makes it so much easier. It makes our job so much easier. So all I can say is we just want to encourage and ask mainstream media to communicate with those people who are working on the front lines, in the front lines, with these various topics. In this case, when it comes to human trafficking, for instance, communicate with those people who are either survivors, be survivor informed, that is vital, and also get your information from the people who are actually doing the work on the ground, so that you understand everything properly in context. But yeah, I mean, there's not much that we can do about what the mainstream media decides to put out there.
Yeah.
But it's
Wouldn't
very
it be?
important for us to engage with them. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be a public service if they had like a strip at the bottom of the page online, which had photos of people who've been kidnapped, and with a hotline number, and then every week update that, because that would put the trafficker in a very, very awkward position, because the people they're trafficking would be recognizable, and once it's out there in the public arena with a hotline number, wouldn't that be a huge deterrent for this whole trafficking industry in South Africa?
I don't think so, Scott, because when it comes to human trafficking, a victim goes through so many hands, first of all. So it would, and also the victims are, I'm just thinking it's a hidden crime. If the faces of a victim is clearly displayed on television, etc., I don't know. It can possibly help.
Anyway, it's something to think about.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's not something that I've thought of before, but it is something that can be considered.
Yeah. Now,
although, I'm just thinking of sometimes with a victim, it often takes a while before one can actually say, is this person actually a runaway? Has this person been abducted or kidnapped? Okay. Is this person being held for ransom? Because that is different from human trafficking.
Yeah.
Is this person still alive? Or has this person been trafficked? Yeah. So it is a little bit more complex, but that's a very nice practical suggestion. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, Tershia, I'm going to wrap up this live stream in a minute. Is there anything you'd like to add to what we've talked about tonight?
No, Scott, nothing really that I would like to add, but just perhaps I just want to encourage people those that are in South Africa, to use our National Human Trafficking Hotline. And I would love to know how many people, perhaps watching this now or maybe watching the recording later, even know that there is a National Human Trafficking Hotline in South Africa. It is something that we really work hard on trying to make it known as wide as possible.
Right.
But that is a number that should be as well known as 10111, which, by the way, I phoned a while ago with an emergency, and I just couldn't get through. But I promise you, with the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, you will get through to them.
That's 0800 222 777.
That's correct.
Okay.
So just to remember that is a number that can be phoned anonymously. So you don't have to fear anything. You can phone anonymously, and you can phone them even if you just suspect something. If you're not sure about a situation, but you suspect something, then you can phone them and you can give them all the information you have, and they can take it further. And then what is also important is in cases where human trafficking is very clear, it is important to get a case number. And I know that people don't want to hear this, but I just want to say this because it is encouraging to hear it. If you get a case number from SAPS, that is all you need to get, because that is very important. Because all the information that you are giving SAPS can be small pieces of a massive puzzle. There are prosecutions that have taken place because people have reported human trafficking, although nothing came of their case. What happened was all these many cases and all these many reports provided little pieces of evidence and little pieces of the puzzle that actually made up this big picture, and it eventually led to prosecution. So that is why I just want to encourage people, you know, if you know of a human trafficking situation and you are able, please go and open a case, get a case number, and you can phone it through to the National Human Trafficking Hotline as well. And you can give them the case number and they can take it further and communicate with SAPS. And what is amazing is it then eventually escalates to the Hawks. And we know that the Hawks do absolutely amazing work in South Africa.
Oh, that's
so
good
that's
to
what
know.
I just wanted to emphasize.
Okay, fantastic. Tershia, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And yeah, look,
Yes,
yeah, and I'm pleased that prostitution law has been put on hold at least. That's a small win for South Africa. Alrighty, look, have a great evening, and we'll catch up again in the future, I have no doubt.
Yes, I look forward to that, Scott. Thank you, and also thank you to your viewers. It's always nice to chat to you.
Yeah, it's been fun. Okay, Tershia, take care. Bye for now.
Okay, bye, Scott.
Okay, guys, that was Tershia de Klerk, and she's from the Joseph Movement. I've put the hotline phone number down below the video, so if you do have a reason to call them, please just do. I'm going to go out with Op ons Rots tonight because we played Hier Bly Ek Boer last night. So here it goes. Thanks to the mods for looking after the side chat, and don't forget, tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Johannesburg time, we have another live stream. Bye for now. Oh, by the way, if you want to know what the live streams are this week, just go to the lovinglivetv.com homepage. About halfway down, you'll actually see a summary, and you can actually get a direct link to the live streams for the rest of the week. Bye for now.
Ons loop hand aan hand op goue warm sand. So baie wat ek wil hê, so baie dit brand. Ek staan op my rots met golwe wat bots. Ons het geen vrees, want hy is in beheer. Ons sien al die planne van goddeloze manne. Ons weet hulle gaan nie wen nie. Dis geskryf soos 'n duif. Ons sal wen, aanhou glo, want hy is in beheer. Waai sterk, dis kragte wat werk. Die gevoel in my hart. Dis vrees wat wil brand. Ons is boere met trots, met my hand teen my bors. Ons ken geen vrees, want hy is in beheer. Ons sien al die planne van goddeloze manne. Ons weet hulle gaan nie wen nie. Dis geskryf soos 'n duif. Ons sal wen, aanhou glo, want hy is in beheer. Ons sien wat gebeur. Die leuen sal ons nie steen. Kom staan nog 'n keer. Ek is stil, want ek weet hy's in beheer. Ons sien al die planne van goddeloze manne. Ons weet hulle gaan nie wen nie. Dis geskryf soos 'n duif. Ons sal wen, aanhou glo, want hy is in beheer. Ons sien al die planne van goddeloze manne. Ons weet hulle gaan nie wen nie. Dis geskryf soos 'n duif. Ons sal wen, aanhou glo, want hy is in